Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation today. My name is Amy Barkley, and I am from Cornell Cooperative Extension, and tonight we're going to talk about the Locavore movement and raising animals for meat. I'm from the Southwest New York Dairy, Livestock, and Field Crops program. My team covers a five-county region, including Erie, Chautauqua, Cattaraugus, Allegheny, and Steuben counties, and we work with the county associations and Cornell University to bring research-based information directly to you. So thanks for joining us. On my team, we have a farm business management specialist, Caitlin Wally. She works with people, paperwork, and profits. Myself, I work with beginning farmers and those farmers who are looking to work with livestock species. Caitlin Miller, who works with field crops and forages, and our esteemed dairy specialist, Camila Lage. Before I get started, because we're working with livestock species today, I do want to share that the information that is included in this presentation is for educational purposes. It's not to be used as a substitute for sound legal counsel or text preparation or veterinary care, with emphasis on the veterinary care since we're talking about livestock. We're dedicated to providing up-to-date research recommendations, and sometimes we get it wrong. So know that we are in a learning process with you at all times, and that our recommendations may evolve over time. So keep checking back with us to make sure that you're up with the most to-date information. I'm not a veterinarian as much as I want to be. I'm a livestock specialist, so I know a lot about a lot of things, but I cannot make recommendations for anything health related for your critters. So if you have any questions, especially about things like antibiotic use and treatment for disease, always consult a veterinarian related to those concerns. And with that, we're going to talk about raising your own meat animals. So we're going today to talk about livestock resource needs, rearing timelines, pitfalls for the common livestock species, and costs associated with getting started. The way that I've formatted this presentation is that I am going to talk through each species individually, going from those that require the least amount of input to those that require the most amount of input from my perspective. And that also follows what most folks get into in terms of starting with livestock and then advancing forward. I wasn't able to include all the species in this presentation just simply because there's a lot of them, but I was able to cover the top ones that we mostly see around. If there's anything in this presentation that isn't covered and you want to ask me, please feel free to reach out and I'll try to help you the best I can. The first thing that we want to consider is, can you raise livestock where you live? We have a huge movement of folks that are raising animals in their backyards, that are starting little hobby farms and farmettes and homesteads, and it's a wonderful, amazing, soul-enriching thing. But one of the things that we have to consider as we go forward is that there's a lot of zoning and regulations that are in relation to what animals we keep on our land, how many animals we can keep, and even within types of animals, males or females. This is especially true for those who are familiar with raising chickens. Usually there's regulations surrounding not being able to keep roosters, not being able to keep things like guinea hens, even though they're considered poultry because they're really loud. So before you get started, if you're not in a right to farm or zoned ag area, my recommendation is to go to your local township and figure out what exactly you can have before you get it. I know sometimes it's really easy to ask for forgiveness instead of permission, but because we're working with living, breathing creatures, if things are found out and we can't have them, it's, I think, better to ask for permission more so than asking for forgiveness. So after you review zoning ordinances and you determine that, yes, you can have livestock, you'll also want to check your soil type. Different soil types are going to help you decide what critters you can raise. There are some really wet soil types with really high water tables that may have you deciding against one species or for another species just simply because of their impact on the land. And you may need to understand how much forage your soil can produce if you're growing forage for some of our forage consuming species like our ruminants. We also want you to take some time and ideate what you want to raise. Have a purpose. Why do you want to do this? And how do you intend to raise it? Do you intend to raise pigs on pasture? Do you intend to raise chickens in a confined or cage-free setting? Do you think that you're going to feed steers in a barn or feed steers on pasture? This is all going to help you understand what your land needs and other resource needs are, and if what you currently have available is something that you can get started with and with the species that you want. The first species that we're going to start with is poultry. Poultry, I call the gateway critter. Poultry are typically what folks start with when they get involved in the locavore movement. So the first thing I want to talk about is what to anticipate when you get chicks. You can get chicks from a variety of places. You can get them from feed stores or mail order catalogs or locally. But regardless, if you get chicks in rather than birds that are fully feathered and ready to go, you're going to need to put them in a brooder. And for that brooder, you're going to need a box or pen or tub or barn, some sort of bedding for those babies, a heat source that doubles as a light source. So usually that's a 250-watt light bulb put in a brooder light, or it is a heater that is designed specially to keep poultry warm. You'll also have to have the appropriate starter feed. I have waterfowl appropriate feed here for waterfowl, but for any chicks, they will need a starter grower type feed and, of course, free access to water. For brooder space, you're going to want it to be large enough to accommodate your young birds, a feeder, and a waterer. So where your feeder and waterer are, you can't count that as floor space for your birds. You'll want to start with about 1/3 of a square foot per bird when you first get them, and as those birds grow, you'll need to increase that size. Different species are going to grow faster than others, so for critters like waterfowl, you're going to want to make sure that you increase that space faster than chickens, which grow a little bit slower. You'll also want to prepare the floor with some sort of something so that the birds don't slip around. Young birds are very susceptible to what we call splay leg, where it's essentially ligaments don't tighten against the body as fast as they may normally in some individuals, and those individuals will have their legs splay outward as they try to walk. Now, you can help them recover from this, but if it gets too far, it's a non-recoverable condition. So for that reason, we highly recommend preparing the wood floor with shavings or straw or some other grippy thing rather than just either plywood or newspaper, because that doesn't give the birds purchase enough to walk on it properly. When we think about housing essentials as those birds grow up and they get out from under the heat lamps and into the pens, we want something that's going to keep them clean and dry, protected from direct sun and wind, but have adequate ventilation. We'll talk about ventilation in a sec, but it's very important for poultry especially. We also want protection from predators, and I think that this is probably one of the biggest pitfalls when it comes to poultry is predation. We find that a lot of free-ranging flocks are susceptible to predation, but so long as they have a fully enclosed house where they can stay at night, this really helps them. And what also helps is to make sure that that house has no spaces larger than about 1 inch wide, so that some of our smaller predators like mink, maybe even rats, can't have the capacity to get into the coop. So that's a really big thing from a poultry perspective. And of course, in the house, we want to have feed and water readily available. We talk about rodent proofing the house. If you want to talk about rodent proofing, that 1 inch requirement for predation protection goes down to a 1/2 inch. Mice can slip through 1 inch super easy. They usually have trouble getting through a 1/2 inch screen. So if you want a rodent proof 1/2 inch screen, you can also take up food at night. Make sure that you don't have a lot of spilled grain outside, that sort of thing that'll help with rodent reduction. We also can have enrichments in our coops, things like hay bales for them to scratch apart or pecking blocks if you find that there may be some boredom and pecking related to that boredom in your coops. We also want perch space, about a 1/2 inch per bird. If they're roosting fowl, if they're waterfowl, they will sleep on the floor. And we also want nest boxes, 4 layers, on the ground for waterfowl. Waterfowl don't jump up into into laying boxes. Instead, they will dig little holes in the ground and lay their eggs in those. So having some clean bedding in the corners of the coop or in nest boxes on the ground can help keep your eggs cleaner. Poultry produce a lot of moisture. They have a special respiratory system that allows them to breathe in and out on every in and out breath. So they're able to get a lot of oxygen into their bodies. And this is a genetic adaptation because birds are descended from flying animals, and flying animals need a lot of oxygen to fly. So, poultry in general release a lot of moisture during that process. And so, that plus their manure means that there's a lot of moisture hanging out in the environment of the coop. And it also means that it can build up in the coop and lead to disease. The winter's especially bad for this just because we have to reduce ventilation because we don't want to chill the birds in the winter. But one of my recommendations is when you're looking at a group of birds in a house, it's better to have cool, dry birds than warm, wet birds. Warm, wet conditions lend themselves to things like coccidiosis, respiratory disease, and ammonia burns, and we just don't want that. So it's important to get moisture out of the house. And depending on the size of the house that you have, you can either opt to have ridge vents or doors or windows that you open to allow natural ventilation to occur. You can place the house in such a way that most of the airflow flows into the house and out of the back. You can have open roof overhangs, it's another method, or you can have a a pressure system where you have barn inlets and fans to pull air through the house. Any of those are absolutely fine, and you'll have to tinker and see what meets the best needs for your flock. When we talk about space considerations within a building, I've broken this down into layers: broilers, which are meat birds, and waterfowl. Stocking density in the barn for laying hens is about 2 square foot per bird. In industry, we see it a little heavier, but in our world where we play, we're going to try to increase that spacing a little bit. And so 2 square foot per bird is good if you have outdoor access. That allows you to get into the coop and clean it thoroughly and keep it rather clean in between cleanings, versus the tighter densities, which are a little bit more difficult to manage. We can also increase that to about 4 square foot per bird if the birds don't have outdoor access. These are my recommendations based on my experience. And I find that 4 square foot per bird with no outdoor access helps with the management of the manure and the moisture in the house. If you have a mobile chicken tractor that you're moving these birds along pasture every day, 1 to 2 square foot per bird of indoor space in the mobile coop is fine. If you're letting them out to roam around, you can go closer to that 1 square foot, but if they're staying in that coop at all times, 2 square foot is better. You'll also want more vertical space for layers in a coop versus broilers or waterfowl, just because the layers do tend to jump up and go up and roost. When we think about our meat birds, our stocking density changes a little bit, and that's in part because these are less active birds. They grow really fast. Their main goal is to eat, drink, poop, live. So there's not a whole lot of interaction that they do with their pen mates versus the layers, which are much more active. So we can drop our spacing requirements if the birds have no outdoor access at all. We want to bias that towards a higher amount of square foot per bird just for our management considerations. Broilers have really wet manure in general, and so it's going to be better for us in terms of the number of times we need to clean out the coop if we leave our stocking density a little bit lower, so fewer birds in the coop. That's why I recommend 1 to 2 square foot per bird. If they're out on pasture, you can probably get away with 1 square foot per bird on pasture, but you have to move that coop probably twice a day to keep them clean and to keep their foot pads intact and to keep them from getting sick from sitting in their own filth. So I would always opt on the higher end of stocking densities, or sorry, the lower end of stocking densities, higher end of space, about 2 square foot per bird, regardless of whether they have indoor or outdoor access. When we look at waterfowl, our stocking densities increase. If you've never had waterfowl before, know that they are very, very messy, in part because they totally wreck water systems in that they will drain water systems in a matter of hours. And they also have manure that's 80% water, so their feces is very, very wet, which leads to soiling of the coop faster. For those reasons, I recommend 4 square foot per bird in a barn setup or mobile coop. And for those folks who raise these birds on pasture with no shelter at all, you can do that sometimes if you have the proper protection from predators. About 50 square foot per bird is what's recommended by one of the larger waterfowl producers here in the US. When we look at our rearing timelines, how long does it take you to get eggs from a layer? We want to brood them in the brooder barn with a light and heat for about 6 weeks, and then we'll grow them out to 18 to 20 weeks of age, at which point we'll switch them over to a layer feed from their starter grower feed, and they will start to lay between 18 and 26 weeks of age, depending on the breed. There are some individuals that come in a week or two earlier. I've seen birds as young as 16 weeks lay in the dead of summer if they were purchased at the right time. There's a lot of things that impact lay for layers, including age, daylight length, weather patterns. So, in optimal ideal temperatures and daylight lengths, the longer days, you're going to get birds that come into production sooner than those birds that are coming into lay in the winter months, where they might have a little bit stunted growth, less daylight, that sort of thing. So, and also know that the breeds like the production reds and the leghorns will come in earlier than some of the later breeds, like I'm thinking about Americanas and French Black Copper Morans and Polish chickens and all of those other specialty breeds tend to come in a little bit later. When we think about our rearing timeline for broilers, we're going to brood them a little bit less. So broilers grow super, super fast. Cornish type are already in 7 to 8 weeks, slow growth 12 weeks, and heritage somewhere between 16 and 20. And because of the way that their bodies work, we want to breed them for about 2 to 3 weeks. After that point, the Cornish and the slow growth birds have enough weight on them and have enough of feathering that they're able to withstand some of the lower temperatures at night if you put them out onto pasture. The heritage breeds I actually recommend keeping for the 6 weeks in the brooder because they feather much slower, they grow much slower, and they're going to get chilled if you put them outside at 2 to 3 weeks in the cooler seasons. But once the nights are above about 55 degrees and the ground is dry, you can put those baby birds on to pasture and start them growing on grass if that is your goal. For waterfowl, regardless if they're geese or ducks, you're going to brood them for only 2 to 3 weeks and then move them off of heat, and then they can go outside. You'll have to look at them to judge whether or not they're ready to go outside. If they cuddle together and they're making really sad beeping noises, they're cold. If you provide a light and they're all huddled under it, they're cold. If you have a large enough brooder and you put the light in and you said they're not going under the light anymore and they're sleeping away from the light, that means that they're ready to go outside. So that happens around the 2 to 3 week mark. I haven't really seen it much later than that. So just keep that in mind when you're brooding waterfowl, they can come off heat a little sooner. Don't be shocked when you see that they grow to full size in about 8 weeks. They're very, very fast growing. And they'll feather out somewhere around 5 weeks or so, 4 or 5 weeks. So their timeline's a little expedited as compared to the layers. You're going to process meat ducks around 8 to 12 weeks of age, and egg-laying breeds will start anywhere between 4 to 9 months, up to 10 or 12 months, again, if they're not started in the ideal season. Chickens, ducks, geese, they're probably our lowest inputs in terms of cost, and so that's another reason why they're really attractive to getting started with. For chick costs, laying breeds are going to cost anywhere from $4 to $12. Broiler chicks are anywhere from $2.50 to $5, and waterfowl are anywhere from $8 to $50. If you want really specialty breeds of waterfowl, like I'm thinking of the Sebastopol geese, I've recently seen the females selling for around $250 a gosling. So keep in mind that depending on what you want, you're going to pay different prices and they can be widely variable. Generally, the more birds you order, and if you order in an assortment rather than individual breeds, you'll tend to get them a little cheaper. And then with broiler chicks, if you order straight run versus males only, or if you order females versus males only, you'll typically get a slightly cheaper price because the females grow a little slower than the males. In terms of a brooder setup, I would budget anywhere from about $40 to $200 for that if you're buying everything new. It could be as simple as just buying the heat light, the feeder, and the water, and the shavings, and it could be as expensive as buying a stock tank or building a brooder for them to live in. In terms of housing, I can't give you a number on that. I just can't. It is so highly variable. I have seen folks convert sheds into chicken coops and it costs them $100. I've also seen people buy 12 bird chicken coops and they from the Amish, and sometimes they cost up to $2,000. So it is highly, highly variable. I'll give you an example of some of our poultry coops. So this coop up top, the one with the A-frame roof, That coop cost me about $600 to build. I believe it's a 10 by 8 coop, not super large, but from all treated materials and tin roof and all that. And then the building below is a 12 by 12 building that we actually renovated from a mini house that was on the property in the 70s. And that renovation took us about $1,000, but we have a larger space. And now everything in there is customized to what we need for a layer building. So, um, again, highly variable. What you do need is some sort of feeder and water system, roosts if you have chickens that are laying type birds, and nest boxes, again, on the ground for waterfowl. And use what you have. You don't need to go out and buy a fancy new coop. The chickens really don't care. And that's kind of how it is with all livestock. Use what you've got. And I highly recommend that because nobody's here to judge how your homestead looks. If your animals are clean, safe, taken care of, and producing, I think that's a win, no matter what type of space you use for your critters. The next cost we have to keep in mind is electric fencing. A lot of times we see predation in our free range birds, and one of the ways that we can prevent that is through electric fencing. Believe it or not, it is highly effective. For our farm, we have only a 1% loss or so from predators every year, and most of those are from aerial predators because we can't protect from those with our current setup. So with these fencing systems, there are a couple of different companies that sell them. For example, Premier One, Gallagher, Tractor Supply, or other farm supply stores also have their own brands of fencing. And in general, it's about $300 for an energizer and about $175 for a 150-foot panel. That's anywhere from 42 to 48 inches tall. This is not made necessarily to keep poultry in. So those birds that are very flighty can fly this fence, but it does have a tendency to keep predators out, because they'll walk up, zap their nose, and then they'll not attack your birds anymore. Generally, this is highly effective. If you put a livestock guardian in with your animals and an electric fence, it's more effective, but we're not going to talk about livestock guardians too much today just because they're a whole nother layer. And this is just a very basics getting started conversation. Consumable costs for poultry. Shavings, around $8 a bale nowadays. I've seen for $7.50 at some farm supply stores, but I would budget $8 a bale. And feed is variable, depending on whether you get it from a local mill or if you buy a name brand. And heck, if you buy organic, it's probably a lot more than this. It is a lot more than this. It's probably around $35 or $40 for 50 pounds. So on the higher end of the name brand, purchase it from a farm supply store, sort of thing. So feed is anywhere from $15 to $25 for 50 pounds for conventional feed. And hens are going to eat about a quarter to a third of a pound per hen per day. Broilers are going to eat about 15 to 25 pounds over an 8-week lifespan. That's for the Cornish type birds. The slow growth birds are going to eat slightly more over that time, and the heritage birds are going to eat quite a bit more over that time, just so that you know. You can buy some supplements. Costs of these are highly variable. Apple cider vinegar for gut acidification, electrolytes for stress periods, snacks like mealworms or corn, enrichments like hay bales and pecking blocks. It depends on where you buy them and who you buy them from, so I can't put a price on that, but use your discretion on what you provide as supplements. Additional costs to consider. Broilers are expensive to process on your own if you have to buy all of your equipment new. Bare bones processing setup, no deals on anything, no real used equipment, maybe some. This could cost you around $750 to start off with. The plucker is probably going to be your biggest cost. Those are somewhere around $400 to $600 for a small scale. And if you decide, oh, processing's not for me and I want to take my birds to get custom processed, expect to pay around $5 a bird for killing and packaging. If you have layers, we recommend from Cooperative Extension to put your eggs in new cartons because there's some regulatory things related to labeling on other cartons if you use them for your eggs. If you're selling to friends and family, you can pack them in whatever you want, but if you're selling them to a market, you have to put them in new cartons. And so the cost for those is anywhere from 35 cents to 50 cents, depending on your supplier, and could be more if you're doing things like stamping your eggs, or wrapping your cartons with twine or what have you. Another thing to consider is fridges and freezers. This isn't just for chickens, this is for all species. You need fridges and freezers to store product, so that meat, eggs, and it's going to be about $1,000 per each for a larger scale, like larger end of residential that most of our farms use. If you can find them used, awesome. I know they're pretty hard to find. So if you're going to budget this sort of a plan out, budget about $1,000 for a freezer. What are the pitfalls with chickens? One of the things that we saw or are seeing in a study that we're conducting across the state is that the highest mortality comes from improper brooder management. So essentially too many birds in too small of a space with not enough heat. And we're also seeing a lot of deaths from shipping stress, which isn't your fault. These birds are just not thrifty when they make it to you. And so those birds will die early on in production. We also see a huge number of losses from predation. I don't need to belabor that anymore. You know what that is. And this year we had a really cold, wet spring, and that resulted in a lot of birds dying from the cold and the wet, especially the broiler birds that were put onto pasture after they had been in the brooder for a little bit too long because producers needed to keep them in there so that they stayed warm. And then at some point they hit the point where the birds were way too big for the brooder. They had to go somewhere. And so they put them outside, and we saw a lot of deaths from the cold and the wet. Because of the wet leading into the spring, then we saw issues with coccidiosis, which is a very common soil-borne parasite of poultry, affects them around 3 to 4 weeks of age or so, and can be devastating for some flocks. It causes issues with nutrient absorption and intestinal bleeding. So those are the biggest pitfalls that I see when we're raising broiler chickens and some layer chickens. We also see slowed growth rate in broiler chickens from a whole bunch of stuff. Feed with too little protein's one of them. Broilers need somewhere around 20-22% protein to start, and you can back that off a little further on. But sometimes if we see birds that are fed like a layer type diet, 16 to 17% protein, that's just not enough for them to grow efficiently, and they grow slow. We also find that birds that are fed an abundance of scraps, kitchen scraps, veggie scraps, what have you, they don't have enough protein that they're pulling out of that for their bodies, so they're not growing as fast. Another thing is bad weather conditions of any kind. It could be cold, wet, it could be hot. Hot and humid is actually really bad for broilers, and that reduces growth rate too. And we also see some cardiorespiratory issues from broilers when it gets really hot out. So things to keep in mind for broiler chickens. One of the other pitfalls I'm going to list is the processing timeline. So Cornish cross type birds, the really fast growing birds, are meant to be processed around 7 to 8 weeks of age. And if they're processed later, you can run into more issues with death from cardiorespiratory disease, issues with feet and legs because their bodies are just too big to be sustained on their feet and legs. And so if you've got birds and they're getting ready to process and you're looking for a processor at the last minute, things can get a little tough because you might have to keep those birds for up to a month more before the processor has a date to get you in. And if that's the case, you may end up with birds that are too big with some of those health conditions that I just listed. So as soon as you get your birds on the ground, or even if you have an order date and know when the birds are coming and they're not here yet, secure a date with a processor, a friend, a neighbor to get those birds processed so that you're processing them the ideal timelines so that you have the fewest losses. Processing birds yourself, if you've never done it, is hard. It's not hard from a physical perspective. It's hard from an emotional perspective, and it's hard from an organizational perspective, especially the first couple times you do it. So if you're going to process birds, make sure you have the knowledge you need and a friend or neighbor to help you with the processing part, at least that first time, so you know what's going on. Expect that you will only process half the birds you think you're going to process in a day that first time you do it. For one person, so I used to process broilers by myself on our farm. I could do 40 of them, and it took 12 hours to do that with just me myself. So keep that in mind. I also had experience processing. I would say for a first time processor, just say it's a team of 2 people, start with 10 or 15 birds, because then you'll get a feel for how your processing techniques will go and how long that processing day will take you. And so that you don't feel really discouraged by the end. Learning to process birds is a process. It could be a pitfall for some people. So start small and work your way up. With laying hens typically are hardy, except for when they're younger, when they get some coccidiosis and some issues with brooder management and that sort of thing. But with laying hens, most of the disease that we see is from their prolonged life, especially in the production breeds like production reds or white leghorns. They see things like cancers from Merrick's disease, which is a very common disease. It's pretty ubiquitous in flocks across the US. Egg binding, older birds produce bigger eggs and sometimes they get stuck and we can't do anything about it. Internal layers, where their egg equipment doesn't catch the yolks like it's supposed to, and instead the yolks end up in the body cavity and it ends up causing disease, and the birds will end up dying from that. Could be internal parasites like worms. We do see that in flocks that are exposed to the same soil for multiple years in a row. Could be external parasites like mites and lice, which I would say affect all of our birds here. And sometimes those infections can be more extreme on some birds than others, and can be more extreme in some flocks than others. One of the things to keep in mind, and it really sucks about chickens and fowl in general, is they don't show they're sick until they're on death's door. And that's more or less all of our livestock species, but chickens especially. So we're working with prey animals, and prey animals don't want to show they're sick because it's a weakness. So they're programmed not to show that until they can't hide it any longer. So just keep that in mind, that sometimes you'll be raising chickens, everything will be great, and then all of a sudden a bird will be really sick on death's door, and you're like, what did I do? It's not your fault. It's just how they work, unfortunately. So just be prepared for that. Another pitfall of laying hens is they don't stay young forever. As birds age, they're going to lay fewer and fewer eggs, and they're going to have a lower quality egg. So at about 2 years or so, we need to make some decisions. We can either sell the birds live, let them live out their own life on the farm, which could be up to 8 years, maybe even 10 years for some individuals. We could make them into soup hens if we wanted to and use that as a value-added product or use it for our own household. And if we don't do that, and we don't keep getting young hens in, we run up against having an issue with keeping up with market demand and personal demands when our birds are aging out and they're not laying as much. So a bird that's about 4 years old is going to lay about 40 to 50% of what she laid when she was 1 or 2 years old. We need to keep in mind when we're rotating new hens in that there's pecking order and aggression that happens with those introductions, and that with age differences in flocks that are multi-age, which is most of our flocks, I would venture to say that most folks aren't retiring whole flocks of birds, cleaning and disinfecting, and then getting whole new flocks of birds in. Because of that, we have age differences, and that results in disease transfer problems. It's just kind of how it goes. So slow introductions and quarantining are really important during those times. And yep, we already talked about egg quality drops. With waterfowl do not do well in confined spaces. They are birds that need quite a bit of space to move around and do the bird thing. They love to take puddles and make them into mud, and it doesn't even have to be a puddle that you can see. It can be a little tiny divot in the lawn with a little bit of water in it, and they will totally make it into a mud pit within a day. It's just what they do. They're looking for grubs and weed roots and stuff, and that's kind of what happens. Because of the way that their whole respiratory system works, they need to have water to dip their head and bill in, fully submerging their head at least twice a week. It keeps their eyes clear, keeps their nostrils clear, and it helps them manage parasite loads. And if they don't have that, you can run into a couple of issues. They're also very long-lived. Waterfowl tend to live much longer than chickens. They're a little hardier, so they live longer. Don't be surprised if your geese live for about 15 years. Don't be surprised if ducks live 8 to 10 years. Very rarely do you find ducks succumbing to production diseases like you do the broilers or the laying hens. One of the other things about waterfowl is if you have a mixed flock, you'll notice that the waterfowl get picked off by predators pretty fast. They're slow, and they're big, and they're heavy, and so that makes them predator targets, so just keep that in mind. These are some ducks that are playing in a ditch. I want to show you what this There's a ditch. This is at our farm. So at the bottom of this is an intersecting ditch that looked like this about a year ago. And this is what it looked like with 1 year with 20 ducks on it. The ducks went through and they did their little shooshaloosing thing. They created this huge water diversion puddle thing. And actually, you can't really see it, but at the top right of the image, you see this trail of brown. They actually broke the side of that dam, and all the water that flows off the property now float down the yard and into the creek way down. So it was just a muddy mess, and ducks do this. It's just what they do. If you provide them a water source like a puddle, or sorry, a pool, they'll play in that, and they will also muddy all around the pool. They're just dirty. It's what they do. So it's endearing. Some people really don't like it. So if you want to keep things clean and dry, ducks are not necessarily the bird for you. One comment quick about niacin is vitamin B3. I do hear a lot about niacin. What is it? What do we need? And waterfowl need higher amounts of niacin than chickens to grow. They have leg growth and development that is dependent on it. But once they're mature, like 8 weeks or so, they don't need it anymore. And so you can either buy an all-flock waterfowl or name brand chick feed that has enough lysine for the ducks and geese. And when you read the label, it'll say, so this example is a do more crumble, and it says for starting chickens, ducks, and geese, for growing chickens, ducks, geese, and turkeys. So it has waterfowl listed in the title, which means it has enough niacin in it to provide for those species, and you don't need to supplement. Most feeds are like this. However, if you have feed that doesn't have enough lysine, or sorry, niacin, you can go ahead and supplement with niacin capsules, liquid niacin or brewer's yeast, and the recommendations for determining how to supplement waterfowl are found at the link below from Metzer Farms. Okay, next we're going to talk about sheep and goats. I find that if you have chickens and ducks, a lot of folks then start into sheep and goats, which is awesome. They're super cute, but they do have some increased needs versus chickens. Housing essentials are going to be the exact same as they are for chickens: clean and dry protection, ventilation, protection from predators, food and water. The ventilation isn't as necessary here, but you still can't have a coop or a pen with stagnant air. There needs to be airflow moving through a barn at all times for our small ruminant species. If you buy in feeder lambs or kids, which are those lambs or kids that have been weaned and you're just growing them out to a finished market weight, you'll need about 10 square foot per animal. If you have ewes or does and you're lambing them out or kidding them out, you're going to need closer to 16 to 20 square foot per animal. When we have a farming system that keeps rams and bucks and does and ewes, where you're breeding your own stock, you're going to want to make sure that you have a separate pen for the ram or buck so that they're not constantly in with the ewes or does and breeding them. And the reason for that is we want to manage our breeding season to a short window so you know approximately when your kids and lambs are going to come. That helps you with managing some of the issues that we see with kidding and lambing, where littles get jumbled up inside and we have pregnancy toxemia and all that fun stuff. So we want to keep them separate, and usually we want to house them with a castrated companion. That's just so that there's no aggression between the two, and you also don't have more breeding males than you want, and it also keeps the breeding males more chill to know they have a friend. One of the things to set up in your lambing or kidding barn are things called jugs. And what jugs are small boxes that are made in the barn to separate a mom and her babies from everybody else. Sometimes you have a heat lamp in there if the babies, are born in the cold weather. But most times there's a feeder, separate water. And it's just an area for the mom and the babies to bond. And then once they're bonded in like 3 to 5 days or so, you'll let them in with the general population again. Any sheep that are showing signs of labor can go into the pen so you can monitor them easier, so that when the babies are born, you don't have things like mom is stealing babies and other sheep trampling babies and that sort of thing. So lambing jugs are really good if you're planning on having your own kids or lambs on farm. Okay, so when we think about fencing for our small ruminants, high tensile works for sheep pretty well, so long as your wires are pretty close together. Woven wire is awesome. Lamb wool gets stuck on it pretty well, but it's not so bad. The sheep rub up against it to itch themselves or to get grass or stick their head through and nibble on the other side, and they will end up um, getting some wool stuck on the fence. But it's nothing other than aesthetic, really. With woven wire, we actually recommend that for goats because goats are skeep artists and they can skinny under fence, they can skinny through fence, they can jump over fence if it's short enough. So we recommend woven wire for goats. Now, if you have goats with horns, just keep an eye on them to make sure that they know they get their head out of the fence if they get it stuck in the fence, or just consider walking the perimeter of your fence to make sure nobody's gotten themselves stuck. Electronet with kind of a woven wire type look is something to consider. It is used quite often for small ruminants, especially in grazing systems where those animals are moved around often. But they do need a training period because they don't understand innately that the fence is electrified and that it's bad to touch it. So they'll need to be trained to it. Um, I it sometimes takes a while, a few weeks. But once the herd or flock is pretty well trained, they'll train others to avoid the fence. The physical barrier is the primary deterrent, the zap is the secondary deterrent. And when we have disbutted animals, that's better for an electric fence system because, like I was talking earlier about goats getting stuck in fence, goats will have less of a chance of getting caught in these type of fences if they have no horns. There are some sheep with horns too. Again, same basic concept. Pasture is very common for small ruminants. Most folks that get small ruminants aren't raising them in a barn setting. They can do perfectly fine in a barn setting, but they also do really well on pasture. And our goal when we put them on pasture is to make sure that we're producing large enough volumes of high quality forage to allow them to get the nutrition they need. Believe it or not, even though goats have a reputation of eating trash, they don't. They can, but they don't usually. They need a higher quality forage than sheep and goats do, or sorry, than sheep do. Goats need higher quality forage than sheep. So you'll want to make sure that the pasture you're producing is of high quality. Pasture fences, perimeter fences, if you're deciding to rotationally graze your critters in there, you'll want a really strong perimeter fence. Perimeter fences act as insurance. And so if you live near a roadway, if you live near a property where folks are gardening and they've got ornamental shrubs, sheep and goats have a tendency to mow those to the ground. They also have a tendency to get in the road and get hit. So having a really good perimeter fence is going to work as insurance, and you should always have a perimeter fence if you're grazing sheep and goats and cattle and pigs and more or less anything. However, one of the things that I've commonly seen is pastures that are way too small for the number of animals that folks have. And what they turn into is technically a sacrifice pasture or a pasture that is not intending to grow forage, but is instead intended to just be an area where animals can exercise. These pastures are usually very highly ridden with parasites. Just because any little bit of grass that grows has parasites on it, and the sheep and goats eat it and they reinfect themselves, and it's a huge problem. So this goat right here looks like he's got some sort of disease process going on. He's super duper skinny. And part of that may be because he's expected to get his forage from a sacrifice lot. Part of that may be because he's got internal parasites. We don't know from the image. So pastures need to be actively managed for sheep and goats. You need to rotate them on when the forage is above 6 inches tall and rotate them off when the forage height dips below 3 or 4 inches or so. This helps with parasite management. We could talk about that more another time, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. With our small ruminant pastures, we want to leave them to rest for about 30 to 60 days in between rotating animals on and off, and that just, again, helps with parasite management and helps the grass to regrow. This is not a well-managed pasture. Yes, there's green there, but see how short that grass is? That is a parasite problem waiting to happen. I'm not sure why these animals are on here unless this might be a petting zoo or something. It looks like it might be. So, this is not how I want your pastures to look. I prefer them to look like this. The image on the left is the bare minimum in height where the animals are foraging in like 4 6 inch forage. And they're probably getting it mowed down a little bit, and then you'll take them off around 3 to 4 inches in height. And then the other pasture on the right is a little more mature, but still a really good pasture for small ruminants. Goats are browsers. Goats tend to eat up. So they will eat young trees, shrubs, multiflora rows, and you can graze them and browse on purpose, but to keep that browse alive, you've got to rotate them off and let the plants reestablish themselves. So you can only really graze browse once or twice a year. Sheep are fine with grazing traditional pasture. Goats will also graze traditional pasture, but they'll eat the most nutritious parts of the plants off, just how they roll. Um, but yes, if you decide to put goats in browse, just keep in mind they'll need to be rotated off or you'll kill your browse pretty quick. A lot of the times we supplement goats with grain. This is again because of their higher nutrient requirement. There are some strains of goats and many strains of sheep that have been developed to live on and gain weight on and have babies on only a forage diet. But there are many that still require grain. So goats especially require grain. Everybody needs a mineral block. We cannot guarantee the minerals in our forages here anywhere, especially here in the Northeast United States. So we want to provide them with a loose mineral block or loose mineral or a mineral block. It's important for the sheep, especially, to receive a mineral block that is a sheep mineral. Sheep mineral has lower levels of copper than other blocks, and sheep are very sensitive to copper. If they consume too much, they may end up with some toxicities and death. So we don't want that. We want to feed them a species-specific mineral. And if you're running your sheep in with other species, just make sure that your sheep are getting mineral separate from your other species and don't have access to other species minerals. I mentioned earlier that we can take our small ruminants and feed them in the barn, or we can graze them, and both are absolutely fine. I've seen success in both systems. The pros of barn feeding are that we can manage parasite pressure better. We don't have growing green forage that the parasites are living on. We know exactly what the animals are getting for nutrition. And if we notice changes in feeding behavior, such as lower consumption, lower water consumption, which we can almost immediately see when we're raising our animals with a defined amount of feed per day, we can very easily pick up illness or stress related issues in our herd or flock. So that's a plus. The cons, it requires more management. You got to go out there and feed them every day, even during the grazing season. Manure management is a thing. We need to manage our manure. Sheep, goats, all of our critters produce a lot of it. So we'll need to manage that manure, get it out of the barn in time, or manage the composting type system underneath them to allow that to build up and not affect their health. And barn feeding is costlier. We have the cost for the barn, the cost for stored forage or grain. Um, it's just a costlier system, but sometimes the pros outweigh the cons. You'll see a slide again for beef cattle, but it goes without saying a well-managed pasture can save you a lot of money. So let's assume that for 2023 prices, our hay is averaging about $175 a ton. So what does that mean if I'm grazing my animals for about 6 months out of the year on pasture? Well, that means that a 150-pound goat is eating about 6 pounds of forage per animal per day times 180 days. That's about half a ton of forage, which is a cost savings of about $92, which is not chump change. And if you calculate in your time to harvest that forage, buy that forage in, if you're buying it in, manage the manure, that sort of thing, it might make sense to graze them from a financial perspective. Or pasture stocking density. We want to target about 5 animals per acre, and that includes those with kids or lambs at their side. Once those little kids or lambs are weaned, though, they count as large individuals, so you'll need more pasture for the same amount of animals. So just say you have 5 mamas, they all have 5 babies. Once those babies are weaned, you'll have 10 animals, then you need 2 acres of pasture. This is for rotationally grazed systems that have that chance to rest and recover over the course of the growing season and is for high quality pasture. If your pasture is just getting started out, if it's lower quality in general, if it's really weedy or really spotty or something, you're probably not going to get this stocking density on that pasture, and that's okay because over time you're going to be able to develop a system that is going to support more animals over time. When we think about our rearing timeline, small ruminants are seasonal polyestrous, which means they breed in the fall and lamb in the spring. Some breeds are more sensitive to the seasonal influence than others, so there are some tactics available to trick females into breeding at different times of year. But if you just let your ram or your buck run with your females all the time, you're going to end up with most of your kids born in that like January to April timeline or so. But we do recommend keeping that male in for only about 45 days so you can better estimate when your kids and lambs are going to be born. Okay, when we talk about time to maturity, we talk about kids and lambs in terms of meat quality as those animals that are under a year of age. As they increase and get over that threshold, then they are considered goat and mutton. Most of the time, people associate goat and mutton with a stronger taste, more marbling, but tougher meat. Um, a lot of times, people are very choosy about what they want, but other times, I feel like folks don't necessarily know the differences between the two. So it's your job if you're selling this product to educate your consumers about what they're buying and what the flavor profile difference is and what to expect and that sort of thing. Know that grass-fed animals are going to grow slower than grain-fed animals, and the meat on grass-fed animals is going to be more flavorful than that of grain-finished animals. Grain-finished animals finish faster because they have more energy in their diets. The grain provides that, and grass only has a limited amount of energy. So, grain-fed animals can get marbled faster and get to market sooner and get you a faster timeline in terms of what you can produce on your land space. For cost considerations, the forage per sheep or goat per year is going to be about $150 to $300. Again, this relies on understanding what your pasture can produce, because even if you have animals on pasture, you may need to feed them in the summer when your pasture growth slumps, or if there's not enough forage on the pasture and you're working on renovating it through animal traffic on that pasture, you might need to feed supplemental feed even during the grazing season. So forage is a little variable in that way, but it's about 150 to 300 per animal. Grain, if you're feeding it, is going to be about $16 to $25 for 50 pounds, depending again if you buy from a local mill or if you buy some sort of name brand feed. And you'll feed about a half to a pound per animal per day. And then a species specific mineral that is good quality is going to set you back about $3 to $5 per animal per year. So, not much in the grand scheme of things. Very important to keep your animals healthy. Right. If you're purchasing animals, if you don't already have a stash of animals or a source of animals that is free, you'll have to buy them. And so the cost for feeder animals is about $3 a pound, and you can get them at multiple weights, just weaned all the way through probably 80 pounds or so, and you can finish them to whatever their finishing weight is. Bottle babies I've seen go from free, because farmers don't want to deal with bottle babies, all the way up to $75 per. Just weaned can go from 125 to 400. That's for females and males. I've seen bred ewes and does go around $250 to $450, depending on pedigree, genetics, and breed. And mature rams or bucks go from free, I don't want him anymore, take him, to $300. And if you're interested in sheep or goats, purchasing them, one of the ways that you can do it is through Cornell Sheep and Goat Management Listserv. This is a listserv of about 900 individuals, anywhere from farmers to industry representatives to extension specialists to veterinarians to shearers, who all get together and talk sheep and goats, and it's wonderful. So if you ever need to buy, sell, ask advice, that sort of thing, go ahead and sign up at the link below on this slide, and it will set you into receiving the emails from the listserv. You can opt out at any time, so it's not a huge obligation, and you learn quite a bit of stuff through it. So I think it's really enjoyable to be a part of. Some of the pitfalls with our small ruminants are parasites, and this is probably one of the biggest pitfalls. Internal parasites are a common killer of small ruminants. We have all sorts. They can lead from neurological disease to nutrient absorptive issues to anemia and death. And dewormer resistance has become huge. There have been recommendations in the past on how to deworm animals, and unfortunately, that advice has led to dewormer resistance. So now, Extension and other research universities are working into finding out how we can manage parasite loads in these animals so that um, we end up with a healthier lot of animals going forward. And so you can learn more about that. I'll show you what that is. It's from Matcha. It's in one sec. But we're first going to talk about 5-point checks. So 5-point checks are the way that we in Extension recommend looking at animals to determine their disease status. This is just for, an FYI. We look at the condition of their eyes, their jaw, their back, tail, coat. If they look sick, they're probably sick. If they look fine, they're probably fine. That's just the general rule that we follow, and a rule that we follow for deworming strategies. If you want to learn more about that, deworming strategies can be done through FAMACHA. This is an evaluation for parasite loads for anemia-causing worms like the barber pole worm. That's one of the most common worms that we have, and one of the biggest causes of deaths of small ruminants. So things like FAMACHA, those classes are offered by Extension, and so keep your eye out for those if you're interested. Ask your local office if they're offering them anytime soon. The more people that ask about these classes, the more apt Extension folks are to schedule them, because we know that there are people who want to attend them. So one of the ways, in addition to FAMACHA, that we can mitigate parasite loads is pasture rotation. And this looks like a really intensive list because it is. We want to rotate our animals off pasture every 3 to 5 days because the parasite life cycle is about 3 days in hot weather. We don't want to come back to that pasture for 30 to 60 days, and we don't want to graze below 3 to 4 inches of pasture height. If you follow these general rules, you'll generally be able to manage your parasites without a whole lot of intervention from anthelmetics or dewormers. If you don't have the capacity to do this, we then need to look into a scheme that helps you manage those parasites through deworming strategies, but selective deworming strategies. Again, the matcha class will teach you all about that if you're interested. Let your Extension know if you are. Lambing and kidding season is also another common pitfall for producers, and this is because a lot of our lambs and kids are born in multiples, twins, triplets. We do get some singles, but lots of twins. And multiple births mean more can go wrong. And a lot of that going wrong is when the kids are in the womb and they kind of jumble their limbs together and their heads go different places where they're not supposed to, and they're not lined up to be birthed through the birth canal properly. That's where we run into some issues. So we want to have lambing and kidding kits on hand. There's some resources for those if you're not familiar with them. We can provide those to you. And we want to have you, if you've never gone through a lambing or kidding season before, or if you're pretty new to it, our recommendation is to build a relationship with a vet or experienced neighbor or friend who's done this before, who can help you through the process. It's not an embarrassment to ask for help, and it's really important to ask for help if you don't know what you're doing. You're reaching into a mother's into her uterus, essentially. So you need to make sure that what you're doing protects yourself and protects her. Decreasing that breeding time to 45 days is really awesome, because when you're looking out for lambs or kids, you know, okay, I've got this month-and-a-half window where I'm going to look for babies, and outside of that window, I don't have to worry about it. And that is one of the huge things to help make managing lambing and kidding season a lot more manageable. Okay. Moving into beef cattle. So beef cattle, I find, are one of those things, either folks get started right with them, or folks go through some of the other species first before getting started with them. But regardless of how you go, beef cattle are super fun. You don't need this gorgeous barn to raise beef cattle. And this is kind of the theme that I've been sharing for all the species. Use what you've got. The minimum is a lot less than for other species. They're bigger. They've got this giant 40-gallon fermentation vat in their belly, and they are staying pretty warm because of it. So what they need at minimum is a windbreak. That could be a tree line. That can be a wooden windbreak that you make against the prevailing winds. A place to get out of the rain and snow. They can withstand a lot of snow, and their hair actually is insulative. So If you see cattle walking around with snow on their back, that's a good thing. It means that they're not losing a lot of energy to the outside world. They're keeping it all against their skin. You want to limit mud because muddy animals are wet, cold animals, and you want to have good airflow wherever you keep them. Dry bedding, deep bedding, it's ideal. It's not required. If you can't manage that, that's okay. But we do recommend that if you have the capacity to provide that. This is a coverall structure on one farm. The cattle are on deep bedding here. It looks like the farmer puts down bedding every time it gets soiled, so every week or so, and builds up that bedded pack. When the cattle move off in the spring, this farmer will clean out the bedded pack and start again in the fall when the animals move off pasture. So this is a method. You can see it's open at both ends for good airflow, but it's likely that the curved ends of this building are against prevailing winds so the animals don't get sick from drafts. This building, totally fine. So you can see that there's an area for the animals to be locked up if the weather's really adverse. They can still reach their heads through and feed in that feeding area out in front. It looks like they have like a headlock sort of system, but it's not really a headlock. It looks like just a fence panel that has wide spacings that can be used for managing the feeding strategy for this. And this works, right? It's covered, it's light, so it reflects sun. It doesn't have a lot of access for wind, and it keeps the animals dry. This is also great. This is a run-in shed. Does the exact same thing as the thing that we saw in the previous image, but somebody built this by hand rather than buying something or reusing something that they found. So in terms of housing, cattle are relatively easy. They do have some minimum needs for pasture fencing though. Again, solid perimeter fence. Make it zappy. Cattle don't like getting zapped. They have very wet noses. And when they bounce up against that, they'll get a little shock. In the summer, when their hair coat's a little thinner, if they rub up against the fence, they can also get a shock. So cattle will teach each other to stay away from electric fence. And then once you teach them that, you can then introduce things like a single strand of wire to separate paddocks for pasture management. And they'll usually respect that single hot wire, but they have to get used to a wire system with electric first before they'll respect that hot wire. Barbed wire fence can be used. It's still used. I don't necessarily recommend it, but it is something that is available and is relatively inexpensive. So you might want to go that direction. You can use high tensile again. You can also use woven wire, and you can include a top wire or two that's charged or not. It is entirely up to you. With the woven wire in mind, cattle will respect it just because it's a barrier. They won't necessarily stay away from it. They can lean into it and rub up against it, and they could ruin fence posts pretty easy. So just keep that in mind. Included in here are 3 different slides of 3 different ways that you can put in fencing of different types. I'm not going to belabor these. These are something that you can go through and read. But essentially it gives you guidance, and this is from Premier One Supplies, is one of the fencing places that you can get fence from. No recommendation here from Extension to use them, just kind of listing what they have available. Their diagrams are also pretty good, so that's why I have them here. So one thing to keep in mind is the costs for this. The costs that they list in these diagrams are from 2021, so they're probably a little higher now in terms of their cost per foot. But a good perimeter fence, one that is like solid nowadays, is going to cost you about $1 to $2.50 per linear foot to build. As you're building pasture, keep that in mind. The larger of an area you enclose, the cheaper per acre you enclose becomes. If you're enclosing a smaller area, it's more expensive for that area within that small perimeter to be protected. So if you have the money to get a larger perimeter fence that you can then later split with hot wires or electronet or what have you, my recommendation is to go in that direction. Okay, this so last one was a barbed wire fence. This is a smooth wire fence. It's woven wire with 2 hot wires on top. More expensive, and then it's probably one of the most expensive fences you can build just because there's a lot of wire involved. And then this other one is just a hot wire type setup. So just a couple of designs for you to look at. These go over corner posts, what posts to use, what tools you need, if you can do it on your own, if you need a contractor, all that kind of stuff. So when we look at feeding strategies for our feeding strategies are going to depend a lot on the age of the animal, the available forage and concentrates. So concentrates being grain essentially, or byproduct like bakery waste or dry distillers grains or anything essentially that is more nutritious than forage. And what our finishing goals are. So do we have a timeline that we want to finish our animals in? Do we want to have them finish to a certain weight? Like, what does this all look like? And that changes our feeding strategy. But before we think about feed, we gotta think about water. Cattle need a lot of water, and they probably need the most water of any of our species that we talk about today. So, generally, as they age, they're going to require more water. This is just for calves, but it gives you an idea. If you get a wet calf, in addition to milk replacer, they also need water. That's a really important distinction and why I put this slide in here, just to keep that in mind. Because we all know that weaned calves, they need water, right? They need grass, maybe some concentrate and some water. But calves who are on milk replacer also need water. So the amount of water per day starts at about 1 to 2 gallons. And by the time they're about 4 months old, they need about 3 to 3.5 gallons of water. So it's not an insignificant amount. Just keep that in mind. We can raise our cattle in a barn setting, just like our small ruminants, and feed them in a barn setting or on a lot, and that's fine. We can also put them out to pasture. If we decide to put them out to pasture, they're going to need about 2 acres of that excellent quality pasture that I talked about before in order to get the nutrition they need to do the thing we want them to do, whether that grow, lactate, grow a calf. A beef animal is going to eat between 3 and 6 tons of forage a year. It's going to be more if you're feeding it a totally grass-fed ration, less if you're going to be feeding it high concentrate ration, finishing type diet where you're feeding mostly grain. And the age that you purchase those animals is going to impact how much forage they're consuming. Younger animals need more forage than older animals that you're finishing. We're going to talk about the value of grazing again. Same price for hay. For 180 days a year, our beef cattle, if we fed them all year in the barn, they'd cost us anywhere from about $250 to $500 to feed in forage alone. This is not including grain if we decide to supplement with grain. So this is assuming the animals are just eating forage. Now, this is 180 days in the barn. This is assuming that hay is $175 a ton. And it's quite a bit of money. These animals are big, and so they consume a lot. Feeding high quality pasture or higher quality forage means that potentially your rates of gain will be better. It'll increase profitability and it'll decrease your finishing timeline. So in general, we want to aim for higher quality forages, but not too high quality. If you have questions about forage quality, you want to get your forage tested, reviewed, to see if it's meeting your animal needs or exceeding your animal needs, let me know. I can help. Finishing timelines. So we want to take our beef type animals to finish where they have enough fat that they are juicy and palatable and tender. And for beef type animals that are fed a standard ration where they're finished on grain and some forage, we're going to take them from about 14 to 18 months of age, which means that they're on a finishing ration for about 140 to 200 days. That's where we include corn in their ration. Holstein animals are going to take longer because the dairy breeds just don't have the muscling properties that the beef breeds do. So they're going to take 16 to 20 months to finish. And they need longer on the finishing ration, again, because their biology is a little bit different. And they're putting on fat and muscle a little bit differently than our beef animals are. If you buy a beef on dairy cross, which I know are popular, they're hard to get right now, but if you get your hands on one, they are going to finish somewhere in the middle, right? So you can buy in feeders pretty easily for beef cattle. You don't have to have mama cows and babies and raise them. You could buy in a feeder animal, a weaned animal, finish it, and that's how you work your operation, and that's perfectly fine. The size that you buy is going to be based on your goals. Do you want to feed forage for a while? Do you want to get those animals on a high energy ration sooner? Do you want an animal that's almost grown? You just want to put the finishing touches on it. You can find calves that range anywhere from about 300 to 900 pounds at the auction barn, through private treaty, like through your neighbor. through a friend, and again, it's all going to depend on your goals, right? So well-managed cattle that are fed a concentrate diet with some corn mixed in are going to gain an average of 2.5 to 3 pounds a day. And grass-fed animals are going to gain about half that a day. So they're going to grow a lot slower. If you're looking to grass feed, it's really important to know that grass-fed animals do take up to 36 months to finish. Another thing to note is that grass-fed animals that are above 30 months of age, or any animals that are above 30 months of age, when they're taken to the butcher, they need to have their whole spinal column removed because it's there's some diseases that we're trying to prevent getting into the human food system that only develop after 30 months of age. So if you decide to take your animals, especially grass-fed animals, out to that 30 plus months of age, be prepared that you will get bone out steaks, which isn't a problem for some people, but is a major problem for others. So if you want bone and steaks, you want to finish them on a faster timeline. That means if you have grass finished, you may be sending animals that aren't super well marbled. If you have grain finished animals, you'll probably get them in on time. It's mostly the cull cows that you're going to have to worry about that with. Some of the pitfalls with cattle include disease. There's quite a few diseases that can affect beef cattle. Respiratory disease is one of the more common ones that we see commercially, and that is in part because animals that are put under a lot of stress prior to experiencing more stress are going to get sick. So, what I mean by that is, for instance, you take an animal, a calf, you wean it, you don't give it enough time to wean it, you put it on a trailer, sent it to the auction barn, somebody else buys that cow, takes it home, and that animal's gone through 3 stressful events in a pretty short period of time, and that animal is not going to grow as efficiently and is susceptible to respiratory disease. There are vaccine programs that farms can be part of that can help prevent these, which are wonderful, and I highly recommend them. If you're interested, let me know. Acidosis is another issue that we see in our ruminating animals, especially our cattle, fed a high-grain diet. Cattle have to be weaned onto a high-grain diet. They can't just be fed grass and then switch over to high-grain. Their gut microbiome will freak out, and they will not tolerate that well. And the animals will get sick, go off feed, lose weight, have diarrhea. It'll be a whole mess if they don't die. So weaning cattle onto a high energy diet slowly is really important over the course of a week or two. Diarrheal diseases like scours affect calves, yonis affects some of our older animals, and these are just something to keep in mind. Look out for. We do have yonis in quite a few herds in New York State and surrounding states, and scours is a really common disease in a lot of our animals. Not so much in pure beef breeds as it is in dairy breed wet calves. Ringworm, it's a thing. So you can see that image at the top of that black calf with all the brownish patches. Those are all hair loss sites from ringworm. It is a human transmissible disease. So if you pet a cow that has ringworm, you can get ringworm. It's a fungus, so you'll have to get that cleared up through an antifungal through your doctor. And then pink eye is another thing that we sometimes see. It's very common in areas where the cattle are walking through tall grass that might scratch their eyes, or if you have a huge amount of flies, like base flies, they can transfer the disease from cow to cow. They can injure the cornea when they're biting the eye, and it can lead to pink eye infections. A lot of times I get questions of, hey, I have this beef cow and it's not growing. Why is it growing so slow? A couple of reasons for that, and I consider these pitfalls just because for those of you who haven't experienced them before, it can be really disheartening to be feeding your animal and saying, my animal's getting all he can eat and he's not growing. Why is he not growing? And one of the reasons is poor quality forage. The lower the quality of forages, second cutting that isn't cut super early, or first cutting that's cut really late, or forages that have just a lot of seed heads on them, or forages that are a lot of lower quality, brushy, shrubby, weedy type harvests, they might not have the nutrition to have animals grow as fast as they need to. And we can improve those pastures over time through careful management and through management of our harvesting. We may have diets that are developed without enough total energy in them, for the fattening process especially. So this is why if you feed a grain-fed diet to an animal, it's going to finish faster than an animal that's fed grass, just because that grain has a lot of more energy in it, which will lead to fattening of that animal faster. Dairy genetics, they take a longer time to mature in general than the beef type animals. Respiratory disease, if you get that, it'll set the animal back at least 2 weeks plus some. And another thing that I see is late castration. We recommend castrating our males within the first 2 weeks of birth. This is going to result in the fastest, the animal's going to overcome that stress the fastest at that age. If you wait to castrate them until weaning, or if you buy an animal and castrate it, at home, just say you bought it 450 pounds and you castrate it, it's going to set that animal back, and that animal at maturity is going to weigh a lot less than that animal would have had you not castrated it late. There was one farmer that I know of who did a side by side where they grew an animal that had been castrated and an animal that had not been castrated. Same exact genetics, same exact forage finishing timeline, grain finishing timeline, and the animal that was castrated late ended up something like 50 pounds less than the animal that had been castrated at 2 weeks of age or less. So it just goes to show that there's quite a bit of money you can leave on the table by taking your castration out longer. When we think about our costs, the cost of forage is going to depend on how much you're feeding it, whether you're feeding it an all grass diet or a grass and grain diet. It's going to be between $250 and $500 per animal per year. Again, highly dependent on good quality pasture. If you have really good quality pasture, you can get rid of some of that dollar amount. For corn, well, so another thing I want to say, this forage is only for the non-grazing season. If you need to feed forage all year round, double that. So if you're feeding forage all year round that's stored and you're not taking those animals out onto pasture, your costs are going to be between $500 and $1,000 per animal per year in forage alone. Okay. Corn's about $16 for 100 pounds right now from my local feed mill. I'm assuming that you're not going to be buying corn in bags from the local farm store. You're going to buy it from a larger mill, a local larger mill. And so about $16 for 100 pounds, and you're going to feed about 10 to 15 pounds per day during that 140 to 265 day finishing process, depending on what type of cow you have. The species-specific mineral for cattle is going to cost you about $35 per animal per year. Now, how much does it cost to buy a cow? Right now, cows are really expensive. You could buy a cow-calf pair for about $2,000, but if you're buying calves or feeders, they're really, really spendy. And the part of that's because we have droughts out in the Midwest that have caused the cattle population to be decreased on purpose to make sure that there's enough feed for everybody. And so we have a shortage of cattle in our food supply chain. And so that's why cattle are so expensive. Cattle prices are at an all-time high. It is expected that they're going to go down at some point. So it may impact what breed you get. It may impact what the availability is or what weight class you buy. So wet calves, so those calves that have just been pulled off mom and sent to the auction within 3 to 7 days of being born, they're selling for around $300 to $750 each. That's for an 80-pound calf. Stockers, they're selling for anywhere. So those are those weaned cows, those weaned, heifers or steers that are going to go into a feeding operation where you maybe could feed them out and finish them. They're going anywhere from $2 to $3 a pound right now. Full-blooded dairy animals are a little cheaper because, again, they take more feed to put on weight and they finish later. So they're about $1.50 to $2.25 a pound. And then cow-calf pairs are around $2,000. If you want to take a look at what the average price is for New York State, or any other state if you're curious, the USDA Ag and Markets website below will take you to average reports for different states and markets across the area. Hogs. So hogs are one of those species, you love them or you don't, and they can be a really fun addition to a farmer homestead, and they can be a really important addition for from a diversity standpoint if you are focusing on selling meat Or heck, if you're selling vegetables and you want to get into meats, pork is a pretty good option, as well as the other livestock species. But pigs are a little different in terms of their housing requirements. They really need a well-ventilated structure, like poultry. Not too hot, not too cold, not too humid, not too airy. They need to be pretty well protected from wind. They need to have shelter from sun. They need to have food and water available. Pigs, pigs root. It's just a thing they do. And so solid concrete floors are pretty much the only flooring system I'm aware of that won't be absolutely decimated by pigs if you put them on it. The space needs to be large enough to allow pigs to go to the bathroom in one corner, because they will. If the space is large enough, they will pick a corner to go to the bathroom in, and they'll sleep in another corner. So it doesn't get super yucky. Pigs, contrary to popular belief, won't just lay in their own feces unless they're forced to keep cool, or if the space is so small that they have no choice but to sleep in their feces. They're actually very clean animals. So the minimum amount of space per animal is about 8 square feet. Pens, the pen walls, they can be made of metal or wood. Use non-treated wood if you do use wood. Pigs chew things. My dad used to raise hogs, and he had a pen of hogs that was outdoors with treated pen. Pretty sure the wood was treated with arsenic. And the piglets always chewed that pen and they always died. And he didn't figure it out till after he got rid of the pigs, and we were having a discussion many years later after I got to college. I learned about all this stuff. I'm like, oh my gosh, Dad, was that treated wood? He goes, oh yeah, it was treated and it had arsenic in it. So pigs chew things, they can get sick, so use non-treated wood if you are using wood to fence out your pens. You can also use metal, like metal bars, hog panels, that sort of thing. Pigs are also known to kind of test the limits of their pens, especially if they get bored and they'll throw their bodies around. They're built like tanks, so it's really important to make a solid build. In the photo, I really like how they've built this hog pen, because it looks like they've got steel reinforcement beams that go down into the ground. And then across those beams, they have wood, but the wood's on the inside. So the pig can't push those panels off if it bumps up against them. It's just gonna, move with the weight of the pig and not, hopefully not break, but not disconnect just simply because those panels are in the right place. You don't want to put them on the outside of the pole, if that makes sense. The yard, you can have a yard surrounded by hog panels or this wooden fence. Either is fine, as long as it's secure. Believe it or not, pigs can also be trained to electric fence, and they can be kept in with one-strand wire. Now, the one-strand wire is more of an agreement between you and the pig and the wire, rather than the pig respecting the wire, rather than the pig being contained by the wire. The pig knows, I think, that it can get out if it wants to, but it's respecting the wire. So you do need to train pigs to hot wire prior to putting them out. One of the challenges that you run into with pigs is if you put them in a hot wire scenario, when they hit a hot wire, their tendency is to go through the wire. I don't know why. They're one of the only species that does that. But so when you teach them, you teach them with a wire against a back panel of some kind that won't bust through when they try to run through it, so that they'll get zapped and they'll know to back away. You need to train them that behavior to back away from a hot wire. If you're putting them out on pasture, you're going to need predator protection for the smaller sized animals, and sows generally can hold their own against some of the wild animals that are out there that can eat pigs. Some of the, once we get feeder pigs above half size or so, they're usually pretty good. I'm adverse to risk, and so I personally wouldn't put pigs out on pasture that were small, or a mom with babies, but some folks do that. And so just make sure you have good predator protection available if you do put your pigs out on pasture. Feeding and drinking systems for pigs are simple. You can feed pigs in a pan. The rubber pans or plastic pans are really nice because the pigs can't destroy them so easily. And then for water systems, you can either use a trough system, but the pigs will dump it and make a wallow because it's what they do. One of the things that I've been seeing more recently is these nipple drinker systems made with 55-gallon drums. They're pretty cool. So the way that they work is you see that And on the right-hand side of the screen, there is a nipple with a little insert in it. And what the pig does is it uses its tongue to depress the insert and it'll flow water into its mouth like a little water fountain. And the pig will drink that. Now, over time, the pigs will learn that they can just sit there with their head, stick their tongue into that nipple, and just drain the water out of the barrel. I'm not gonna say they typically don't, or they typically do, but it can happen. So just keep in mind these systems aren't foolproof, but they're a way to keep your pens a little bit drier. When we think about finishing timelines, you want a 6-month animal that's about 220 to 300 pounds. That's pretty well the gold standard. That's because at that size, you have enough weight on it to make it worth your time to butcher, but at the same time, you're not so fat that you're cutting off extra fat and leaving it to waste. Modern genetics of most of our species, Durocs, Yorkshires, Berkshires, large whites, that'll get you there to that, 220 to 300 pounds in 6 months. There are fat type genetics that will not get you there. So know what kind of pig you're raising and know how long it takes to get that animal to its slaughter weight so that you are choosing to send it at the ideal time. One of the most common ways to raise pigs is buying weaned piglets about 8 weeks old and then finishing them out to that 6 months or sometimes 8 months of age. Other folks find that they want a farrow on their own. That is keeping sows and boars or just sows and artificially inseminating them, breeding them, having piglets, either raising the piglets or selling the piglets. The farrowing on your own is much more resource intensive. If you want to start raising pigs and you've never raised pigs before, my recommendation is start with the weaned piglets and get started that way. Just because then you'll understand pigs and how pigs operate. And then if you want to go into farrow to finish, you can choose to go that way. So lard type versus meat type. This is a visual representation of what I shared. The meat type are just bred for efficient muscle production, and the lard type pigs are meant for dual purpose. They were originally developed with colonists to provide fat for cooking, fat for light, and also meat to eat. So those animals don't grow super efficiently. They don't finish, well, they have a really nice marbling, but they don't finish super efficiently. And there's a lot of fat to be cut off at the butcher if you don't want fat. So just keep that in mind. There's also small animals. Some island type pigs, coonies, I think are one of them. They take a long time to finish and they're fat-ish type and they're slow growing. Just know what you're working with and know what your finishing timeline is. Okay, so when we think about disease, disease in pigs is easily caught and transferred. It's just because of the way their systems are, kind of like how chickens easily catch disease and transfer it. Diarrheal diseases are probably one of the most common in pigs, and it spreads like wildfire because piglets are curious and they get into everybody's poop and then they all get infected. Respiratory disease, I also think is pretty common. This is mostly from stress associated with and in association with poorly ventilated structures. Stagnant air, lots of ammonia, that can result in respiratory stress, disease, and respiratory disease. Internal parasites are not a huge issue in barn settings, but they're a pretty big issue on pasture. So a deworming scheme is important to have if you're deciding to raise pigs in the woods or on pasture. And hernias are something else that we come in contact with quite often in the pig industry. That is when the abdominal wall has like a tear or a hole in it and intestines pop through. Sometimes they pop through the skin in very severe cases. In other cases, they just cause this little bubble at the skin surface. This piglet has I believe this is an inguinal hernia. So these are intestines in here. This is a male pig. And so one of the big issues here is we can't castrate this piglet. If you castrate this piglet, its guts will spill out and it will die. So with hernias, there are some ways to manage around them. I wouldn't say they're super common, but I've seen enough of them to say they're common enough that you might run into it. So one of the pitfalls of pigs I call destruction. Pigs have rooting behavior. Like I said, they will destroy a floor if it's not a solid concrete floor. If that floor has cracks in it, they will dig up your concrete. They're just curious and they root and they're super, super strong. They will also uproot pastures in forests with young trees. They'll uproot and kill trees. It's just what they do. They're exploring their habitat, and in such they will destroy things. They also wallow. So this is a picture of a pig on pasture. It somehow got access to this water. I don't know if I don't think it's water from its dish. It might be water from a stock tank that the pig has learned to overflow. It could be that this is just an area where there's a lot of water that comes off of the hill behind it. But it's flowing down and the pig has made itself a nice wallow. Pigs don't sweat, and so to cool off, they need evaporative cooling, and that's why they create wallows. Um, so just be prepared for that if you have pigs. Pigs are also very sensitive to hot and cold. They don't have a coat of feathers or a coat of fur or a very thick coat of hair that they can use to tolerate temperature swings. So if it's too hot, they don't grow well. They're heat stressed, they're panting, they're drinking more than they're eating. They don't want to eat a lot of salt because it dehydrates them and there's salt in the feed. They need shade or water, like the wallow, to cool off in. And if you decide to raise pigs on pasture, sunburn is actually very common in the white skin breeds. It can be irritating, and you might want to try to avoid that by letting pigs outside when it's cloudy or when it's the later part of the day or the earlier part of the day where they're not going to get super sunburned. If it's too cold, they're going to slow growth again because they're burning energy to make heat. And in those systems where it's cold and they're not in a temperature regulated barn setting, you might want to consider having deep bedding of hay or straw to help them bury themselves in. They'll actually make these little beds where they tuck themselves in and throw hay over the top of themselves and all lay snuggled together like little piggy burritos so that they stay warm. But they have to have that hay or straw available for them to do that. So just keep that in mind if you're growing pigs in the winter. Pigs are relatively inexpensive. Prices have definitely gone up. And I would say in this $100 to $200 range, I'm seeing more piglets around the $150 to $200 range. Very infrequently am I seeing them around $100. I might see that for just weaned, like 6 to 8 week old piglets that are going into fall when it's the season that most people don't want to get started in pigs because they don't want to raise them through the winter because they grow slower. It's up to you, but feeders may be seasonally unavailable. In our area, we have a lot of show pig breeders. Those breeders will send pigs to kids that are growing them out for fair before they send them or sell them to the general public. If you don't have a relationship with a farrowing operation that can provide you piglets, you may be on a wait list. So a lot of things to consider when getting piglets. They're getting harder and harder to find right now. But I think that if you do a little bit of digging and a little research and make some connections ahead of time, you can have a reliable source for piglets into your future. For feed, pigs really need a primarily grain diet. They can be fed things like whey or waste milk or waste food. They cannot be fed trash or garbage. And part of that is meat and meat scraps. That's for disease mitigation, but they can be fed things like vegetable scraps, so long as they're picked through and you make sure there's no plastic or rubber or some of those food labels or anything on them. But they will digest milk and milk products effectively. They don't typically digest fruits and vegetables super effectively in terms of weight gain. Think about us. If we ate a lot of cheese, we'd gain weight pretty quick. If we ate a lot of cantaloupe, we're not going to gain weight as quick. So pigs are very similar to us in terms of the digestive system they have. So we can compare ourselves to them pretty readily. Giving them that grain diet that's balanced is going to help them perform to their biggest potential. Pigs also don't digest forages readily. They're not built with a digester in their belly to digest cellulose and lignin and hemicellulose and all the things that are like the plant sugars that are not readily available. Yeah, they can take a little bit off of them, take some of the carotenoids, some of those things that make the meat nice and a little darker, the fat darker, maybe a little more flavorful, but they're not going to pull a lot of nutrition off of that. So always full feed your pigs with grain. and then supplement them with the other things, unless you're working with a nutritionist to help develop a program with things like whey or waste milk. Pig feed costs are going to be about $10 to $15 for 50 pounds of feed, and you're going to feed from 5 to 7 pounds a day, which equates to roughly 550 to 750 pounds if you get a wean piglet in and finish it out. So if you do that math, you can find out approximately how much it'll cost you to raise pork. Okay, so before we depart our conversation this afternoon, I want to talk very briefly about getting your animals processed. We can process them a couple of different ways. We can go through a USDA butcher first. This is the most highly regulated from the butcher's perspective, but allows you as the producer the most freedom. If your goal is to sell individual cuts of meat, you have to go USDA. You can also sell halves, wholes, and quarters in boxes by this method, but it's a little more expensive to get USDA processed. You might want to go custom exempt for halves, wholes, and quarters, but USDA allows you to sell by the cutter by the pound and no regulatory limits for sale, and you can sell over state lines, which is really awesome. If you're doing custom exempt, we call them custom around here, and what that is essentially is you come to me and you say, "Hey, Amy, I'd like to sell you a half of my pig." And I say, "Yes, great. I'd love some bacon for my freezer." I would pay you for that pig in advance. And then as a service, you take that pig to the slaughterhouse, you get it processed. I would pick up the meat or you would deliver the meat to me as a service. In that way, I've purchased that animal in advance. So the liability has changed hands to me. I decide that, yes, you can take it to that butcher for me, rather than going on the blind faith of you've taken it to the butcher, you've done everything right, right? That's the blind faith in USDA. It's not ill-placed faith. It's perfectly fine placed faith. It's great placed faith. But custom exempt is not as highly regulated, which allows the butcher more freedom, but takes some of the freedom away from you as to how you sell your meat. You have to sell it in advance of the animal being slaughtered, or it you can't legally do that. So that's custom exempt. That's mostly for halves, wholes, quarters. And you could technically do boxes where just say, you know, you're going to get 500 pounds of meat off of a cow. You could say to 5 people, hey, it's going to be about this much money to buy a box of 100 pounds of meat. Do you want it in advance? And you sell those in advance of you taking the cow to the butcher. So that's another way you could do it. One of the things that I wish we had more of, but we just don't, is on-farm slaughter for personal consumption. You cannot sell the meat for that. You can butcher it yourself and keep it for your family, cook it for your friends. That's okay. But there's a lot of regulatory, uh, there's a lot of food safety concerns when you're processing your own animals, because butchers, regardless if they're custom exempt or USDA, have to follow a strict set of regulations to make sure the animals are getting to you safely, so that meat is safe for consumption. With on-farm slaughter and personal consumption, um, you can do whatever you want, chill the meat however you want. It's not regulated, so that's why you can't sell it. But you could definitely do it. And I find that's probably one of the most humane ways to slaughter animals, because you're slaughtering them at their home farm, you're not taking them through the stress of going to the abattoir, and it's just a better experience for them. Instead of one bad day, it's a bad minute. For processing fees, if you're going to take it to a USDA butcher or a custom exempt butcher, you're going to see kill fees of about $75 to $110. And then on top of that, you're going to pay 85 cents to $1.10 or so a pound for cut and wrap. And that payment for cut and wrap is based on the weight of the hot carcass. So what the butchers will do is they'll get your animal, they'll kill it, charge you the kill fee. They'll take off the head, the hide, the guts, the feet, and the tail, and then that's your hot carcass weight. Then they will take that animal, age it if it needs to be aged, otherwise they'll cut it as soon as it's cool, and then that's what they charge per pound cut and wrap. You could choose bone in or bone out. You're generally going to get more meat back with bone in because you're keeping the bones in, so it's a little bit heavier. Bone out, obviously, you'll get a little bit less. Now, if you're looking to get animals processed, I highly recommend securing your butcher slot as soon as possible. And that's because a lot of times butchers are really booked. We have a shortage of butchers here in Western New York and honestly all across the country. So if you know when your animal's going to be ready, book that butcher slot ahead of time. Could be up to a year in advance before the animal's even born, but book it. And then you can make sure that your animal can get into the butcher to get processed in the appropriate amount of time. So you're not overfeeding an animal or underfeeding an animal to get a butcher slot. So this is just a list of anticipated yields. So poultry are going to yield you of meat, bone-in, or yeah, I'd say these are mostly bone-in. Poultry are going to get you about 75% of live weight. Sheep and goats 33%, cattle 40%, and hogs 50%. So when you send a 1,000-pound cow up to the butcher, you're only going to get about 400 pounds of meat back. So this is just kind of to keep in mind. So if you're looking to grow a certain amount of meat, now you know approximately what poundage your animals have to be in order to get the poundage of meat back that you want for your family or to sell. And the last thing I want to mention is a small note about vet care. You probably noticed that there are no antibiotics on the shelf at your local farm supply store anymore. That's because as of June 2023, antibiotics now require a veterinary prescription. There are still dewormers on the shelf, there are still vitamins and minerals and that sort of thing, but there are no antibiotics that are of human significance, Tylan and penicillin, for instance. You need to develop a relationship with a vet, and that vet will be able to write you prescriptions. And generally, you'll be able to see that vet once a year to keep up that veterinary client-patient relationship. So I'd go ahead and budget about $150 to $300 per year per annual visit from that veterinarian. And I'd also budget a little bit of money for emergencies, like especially for our larger animals, C-sections, euthanasias, hoof rot, your animal decided to get caught in the fence, like anything like that. Make sure that you have some money saved aside for emergencies. What you save aside is up to you. What your decisions are for your animal's care and health is up to you. But if you intend to use a vet, keep a little money aside. Where there's livestock, there's trouble. So I just want you to be prepared. All right, and that's all I've got for you for today. So it's wonderful to come and speak with you today. I love teaching about this stuff, and there are so many different directions that we can go from this presentation, and I'm happy to work with you one-on-one for those if you're in my region. If you're not in my region and you're watching this, feel free to contact your extension educator in your region to get started. If you like programs like this and want to see more like this, please help us create programming that means the most to you by letting us know what you felt about this presentation and what you want to learn more about it. And I thank you for your time. Have a wonderful afternoon, evening, morning, and we'll see you later.